The first time I met Professor Ben Teehankee was years before the pandemic at a coffee shop along Taft Avenue. He was working on research examining the assumptions and interpretations corporate managers were making on analytics, blindly trusting the numbers without understanding the mechanics behind the data. He was ahead of his time, I told him. With a few exceptions, most companies had barely scratched the surface when it came to data and analytics, much less blindly trusting it. That first conversation for me were the beginnings of the ideas that would eventually lead to the formation of Data Ethics PH years later. Welcome to Data Ethics Conversations. Today we talk to Ben Teehankee, professor at De La Salle University. In this conversation, we talk about the fundamentals of ethics in the workplace, the role of science in data, and the professionalization of the data science practice in what could be the definitive data ethics conversation. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Twitter at EthicsPH, and on LinkedIn at DataEthicsPH. And now, my conversation with Ben Teehankee. So welcome, Professor Ben.
How are you, Doc? Good to be here.
So I'll let you introduce yourself and your background, and maybe let's get on with the topic.
Okay, so let me just flash my slide here because it will show my title. So I thought I'd take a step back and look at the big picture of how data is being used now and what I think might be good to pursue moving forward. So I chose this title of Professionalizing the Production and Use of Data. And for me, professionalization really, in the case of data, is the combination of ethics and science. So this will be the running theme of what I'll try to explain. So I'll touch on a number of things, and depending on the time we have, I wanted to give a little bit of a perspective so you understand where my title came from. And this is probably the time for me to introduce myself. I have been teaching at De La Salle University since 1983, and my background is really in behavioral sciences and management, and also in statistics. So I did my studies in business and management and behavioral sciences at De La Salle, and I did my master's in statistics from UP. So you might say that the way I approach this topic is really from a very managerial point of view. And this makes sense to me because ultimately, no matter what the technology is, no matter how advanced the advances in data science, somebody has to pay the bill for these kinds of technologies. And 99% of the time, it is businesses that pay to use these technologies. So the importance of ethics, especially when this is used in organizations, cannot be overstated. So that's where I'm coming from. So recently, what I've been teaching and doing research on has been on corporate governance and humanistic ethics. So I'm always very interested in how businesses can improve the way they make decisions so that the outcomes will always be better for people. Based on that, I will touch on some basic principles of ethics. There's a lot of specialized ethics related to data ethics, and you would be very knowledgeable on that. But again, my approach here, so that I don't duplicate stuff that you've already discussed, is to step back and really look at ethics writ large, no? Looking at some fundamental principles, which I think apply equally to data ethics. And then I want to introduce this idea of science, because for me, data without science is extremely dangerous, because science is what gives the critical thinking that is essential to using science well. Okay, so with that as a roadmap of what I'm going to discuss, let me dive right in on the perspective. So the first thing I want to point out is we have certain fundamental problems. So as we all know, information, computational, and network technologies, and some authors have called this the infosphere, has been advancing at such a tremendous speed. Some futurists have said that the changes we will see in the next 5 years will be more than the changes we have seen in the last 40 years. And that gives us an idea that this is really exponential speed of change. But one of the results of such advances is that the sophistication of tools that can produce and analyze data has become almost beyond the reach of ordinary people. Because sophistication brings complexity. And when you have complexity, specialists have to come in. And when specialists come in, they deploy very technical knowledge. And the problem with very technical knowledge is that people become separated into silos. This was a problem before, as we all know, even in standard businesses. Oftentimes, finance people don't speak the language of marketing, who don't speak the language of operations, who don't speak the language of IT. But when data professionals came in, or should I say data specialists came in, this was a huge island of knowledge that nobody else could talk to. And the result of that is that a lot of data specialists are now involved in building models that affect people in certain areas, which we call domains, for which they don't have direct experience. And the challenge with that is there is a loss of common sense. I suppose one analogy I can use is like playing a video game. So imagine if you were playing a video game that can direct vehicles or make decisions at a remote distance. This is what it has come to be. A lot of people are now building models that affect people from so far away, the concrete situation of whom they know nothing about. So this is part of the result of the sophistication in data analysis. I always like to cite this picture because when I teach statistics, one of the first lessons I teach my students is that the mean doesn't mean anything. And they always get shocked about this because, as we know, the mean is one of the first models we learn in statistics, right? It's how we compute our grades. And in fact, everything that we do practically, all regression models, analysis of variance, all of these are based on the mean. But actually, the mean, if we think about it, was developed ages ago when computers did not exist and there was no easy way to summarize so much data. So somebody had to come with a measure that could summarize. Obviously, there is very little need for summary nowadays because, as I said, there is just so much technology. You can look at the entire distribution of data. But you can see in this figure what happens when people misunderstand the use of statistics. Here, the sign just says the average depth is 3 feet. Now, this poor guy, of course, has his own idea of what an average is and walks across and, of course, drowns to death. And this kind of error looks funny in a cartoon like this, but in real life, this kind of mistake happens all the time. We use summary statistics to make decisions that affect individuals all the time. And I'll touch on that more later. So continuing, O'Neill, one of my favorite authors, she invented a term for this. When we don't understand the models that we use, because they have become so sophisticated and the people who design them do not have concrete knowledge of what they're applying them to, we have what we call weapons of math destruction. Obviously, this is a play, right, on the military term. But what she says is, for example, algorithms, regression coefficients, even simple use of proportions, let's say in electoral surveys and so on, sometimes they can be very destructive because they are opaque, meaning you don't know what's happening behind the background. They're unregulated. Nobody checks if they're even being calculated properly. We can only cite our own uh, automated elections in the Philippines. The law requires that the code for the election machines should be exposed to the public. It was never actually exposed, right? So they're very difficult to contest. And despite these limitations that they're mysterious and there's nobody checking on them, they're quite scalable, meaning you can grow them so fast, they're almost like viruses. So if you have a bad algorithm being used in one company and they're getting what they call good results from it, let's say in approving loans or hiring decisions, then another company will probably buy the same algorithm and use it again. And so before you know it, that same algorithm is being used everywhere, but nobody actually knows how it works. And that's what O'Neill calls weapons of math destruction. So Floridi pointed out that, of course, in balance, information and communication technologies have really achieved so much for us. I personally cannot imagine life without these technologies. But, as Ben Parker said, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So that's why I feel that when something is so powerful, that's when you need to professionalize its use. And that responsibility often falls on organizations because, as I mentioned earlier, it's organizations that really spend the money to utilize these kinds of technologies. So given this backdrop, enter my thesis. So my main thesis really is that there is a very urgent need to professionalize data analysis and use. Otherwise, the result is what we call a mercenary system. Now, we can imagine the image of a mercenary. Normally, this would be somebody with very advanced military training. Why is that? Because that person was probably trained in the military, right? A retired soldier, let's say a sniper or a detonation specialist, the government spent so much so that that person will have the most advanced skill precisely to defend the country. But after a tour of service, when that person retires, guess what? What does he do with all that skills? He becomes someone for hire. And therefore, we can never tell how those skills are used. The same is true in any advanced field, and more so now in data science, algorithms, AI, and even networks, no? Hacking, and so on and so forth. The reason is everything now is influenced by information technology. So people with the most advanced information technology skills are literally, possibly, mercenaries in this system. So to turn from a mercenary system to a professional system, we need two elements. So these two elements are essentially ethics and competence. So ethics is the foundation for the proper design and use of data and models. And when I think of ethics, I always try to associate this with something we all understand, which is character. Character is essentially the concern for and pursuit of what is ethical, or what I call truth with a capital T. So essentially, when you're dealing with a person with character, you trust this person. You know that when you're around this person, he will make decisions that will not put you in harm's way. In fact, your tendency is to believe that he will do what is in your best interest. And that's what character is. So if we think of all professional fields, whether these are lawyers, lawyers protect our property, our life, even our privacy, etc. Engineers protect our safety. When they authorize an elevator or a building, of course, we feel safe in it. And that's why these are licensed professionals. Their advanced skills are used to promote human welfare. Number three, the second component of professionals, of course, is their competence. Their body of knowledge is very precise, highly developed, codified, tested over time, and this is transmitted to the next generation of professionals. So this knowledge of certain systematic vocabulary, for example, procedures, is what makes them competent. And when a person is competent, he is pursuing what I call truth with a small t, or scientific truth. So essentially, professionals deal with two truths. They know the truth of competence, meaning they know how to do things that very few other people know how to do. So as we said, lawyers, engineers, doctors, and the same can be said of programmers and algorithmic designers and big data engineers and database designers, right? But of course, all of that has to be tempered with character. So my thesis is that the competence part has moved so fast that there is a difficulty for the character part to catch up, because people think that these are just tools. People think that if you can write a program, whether it's in Python or in R or whatnot, these are just technical things. But we know that that's not true. The moment any program is deployed by a government agency or a business, it affects real people. And this is where character comes in. So that's why I had a look at the APEC data science analytics competencies. And this was proposed sometime, I think, maybe 5 years ago. You would know more about this. And looking at the competencies that are listed, it seems evident to me that a lot of these are the key technical competencies that are very important for people who use data in an organization or decision-making context. And I was quite interested to realize that right down here at the very bottom, and it's called 21st century skills, it includes what I'm referring to. There's critical thinking right there, and there's problem solving right there, and of course, ethical mindset right here. And this is essentially what I'll be touching on. But for me, of course, if I had a choice, I would put this as the first skill, because otherwise, as with anything we cover in class, and this happens to us all the time, when we're covering 10 topics, well, guess what? The typhoons come, class cancellations come, and guess what? Which of these topics will be dropped? of course, it will be the 10th topic, right? So if it were up to me, this should be put first, because if they forget the other 9 topics, the students can find a way to learn them through other means. But this is extremely important. So let's tackle the ethics part. And I always think that professionals have one thing in common. They take a pledge, and therefore they are actually agents of the state. When you get a license as a lawyer or an architect, you take an oath in front of a government official. That's because you're essentially pledging yourself to be an agent of the good of the nation. And therefore, the discussion of ethics always begins with the Constitution. And Section 9 of the Constitution makes it very clear that the vision of the country is to achieve a rising standard of living and an improved quality of life for all. This is our essential goal, which is why when you were speaking about the recent series of typhoons, and we can see the devastation on our people, clearly we have ways to go to achieve this. Because prior to the pandemic, our poverty rate officially was about 16 to 17%. Of course, people say the government always understates it anyway. But by some recent estimates, with the pandemic and with the 2 typhoons we just underwent, poverty is around 30% at this time. And so if we look at the economy, of course, this was pre-pandemic, we've seen a lot of growth in businesses. So if you look here at the stock market, for example, this is the stock market here, the dark line. This was in the late 90s when the stock index was just about 2,000. Right before the pandemic, it was about 7, 8. So you can see that the wealth of those who have stock has ballooned. And then, of course, our GDP growth has also been positive, averaging about 6.5. Of course, this was all prior to pandemic. Uh, it is estimated that our economy is shrinking at least 15% because of the pandemic. But I just state this to say that businesses have been growing, and a lot of the technologies that we use, especially in data-related professions, have been fueled by this growth. But unfortunately, this has not really been distributed. The problem is we have very deep structural problems in our country that makes the fruits of growth go to only very few. That's what I call a structural problem. In fact, the former NEDA chief, Shell Habitos, said that 70% of the growth of the country is equivalent to the increase in wealth of only about 40 families in the country. So the top 40 families in the country usually grow in wealth 70% of the growth of the whole country's wealth. This was the latest poverty map from the government, which again dramatizes what I mean by the mean not meaning anything. So of course, a 16.6% poverty rate is a mean, it's the average poverty. And this is based on 10,481 a month of income. If anyone can believe that you can raise a family of 5 with 10,481 a month, but they have calculations for this. But assuming for argument, but we can see right away that the mean, which is 16.6, does not hold for any part of the country. Because where you see red, such as here, where Marawi is, poverty is above 60%. And where you see orange and yellow, poverty is anywhere from 22 to 60%. And of course, this is where typhoons love to enter, 20 typhoons a year. And we just saw that again this time around. Poverty is very, very high. So where you see green, poverty is below 12. And of course, you see pockets of that around Metro Manila and some parts of Davao and Palawan here. So we have ways to go before we achieve the vision of the Constitution. And this is, again, one of the reasons why official government figures are extremely misleading. And this is a classic demonstration. Why do you need to report a poverty rate when you can just show the map? A visual display literally says 1,000 things more informative stuff than this figure can ever give. In fact, I think we should retire the mean. There is no need for it. It's just a sentimental thing that we hang on to because one, they're easy to compute using computers, right? But well, we can all agree maps are also easy to produce using computers anyway, and data visualization is the most important trend now. So this is a classic example of This is the ethical challenge of our country. Uh, our country has the slowest rate of poverty reduction in ASEAN. This is us, the red line right here, from the late 80s to around 2016. You can see the phenomenal reduction in poverty of China, of Indonesia, and of course Vietnam. Of course, Thailand and Malaysia have had poverty rates way below us for the longest time. But the Philippines, we have a lot of challenges reducing our poverty. So therefore, the shape of our country is something like this. But the goal of the Constitution is to grow the middle class. This is why businesses are extremely important. Businesses of all sizes, from the smallest to the largest, because they create the jobs, they distribute wealth, at least they should. And our goal is something like this. So if we can do that, we can achieve the Constitution, the goal of the Constitution. And all professionals are essentially in the task of helping the country achieve this vision. This is why the Constitution goes on to say that when we now focus on economic agents, and these are businesses, they shall contribute to the common good. And what this means is that all businesses have the duty to transform our society from this shape, to grow the middle class to this shape, and essentially achieve this. This is what other countries have done, the Scandinavian countries, of course. We all know that Norway, Finland, Sweden, they were all, the land of the Vikings, and they were really barbaric, if you would say that. But they're now among the most modern countries in the world. In ASEAN, when I was born in 1962, we were number two only to Japan. Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, these were all what we would call talahiban, right? So they were all like this. But the rest is history, because we have Korea, Taiwan, even Malaysia is a lot like this, while we remain here. So that's why we need to really enable the achievement of the Constitution. And the way to do that is to promote distributive justice and to promote the common good. So in pursuit of this, what the Securities and Exchange Commission has done is it promulgated the Code of Corporate Governance in 2017, when it said that the role of businesses, this is Principle 16. Actually, I always find this a historic event, and I had some inputs here, although it took us 15 years to convince, 5 years rather, to convince the Securities and Exchange Commission to put this in. But essentially what it is saying is that all companies should be socially responsible in all its dealings with its communities. And it must serve the environment and its stakeholders in a positive and progressive manner. So when we speak of flooding, for example, a lot of floods are contributed to by rampant and uncontrolled development. Development not in the positive sense, but what I mean, subdivisions, condominiums, the conversion of agrarian land to commercial property, such that water has no other path to go but to flood houses and to, carry people away. So this is a problem which is the attempt of Principle 16 is to address that, to remind businesses that their role is to always be a positive effect to the people and stakeholders around them. So that brings us now to this slide, which tries to summarize what happens when you now bring ethics to the level of decision making. So normally when we speak of ethics, we apply at least a 6-way test. Now, first we look at rights. Does the act respect the rights of everyone concerned? Does it treat everyone as persons and not merely as things? So when we cite the case of the Facebook scandal, for example, how data was being used by third-party users of Facebook to influence them for targeted political advertising, or personal data was being sold without their consent. This is essentially a violation of personal rights, because people should not be used to benefit others without their consent. So consent is essential, because a person is not a thing. He has faculty, he has certain needs, such as privacy and so on. So rights is the most basic principle that we use for ethics. The second one is human dignity and the common good. Now, this is a little bit more sophisticated, so I'll give more details on this. But essentially, when a decision maker makes a decision, and certainly professionals, we ask, will this improve the welfare of another person? So here, we're just making sure that the rights are not violated. But here we're thinking of a positive impact on people. So for example, if I create an algorithm that will push a targeted ad at a person, the question I need to ask is, but is this ad really useful for that person in the sense of a positive thing? Or will this ad actually convince that person to buy something he or she doesn't even need? Or worse, might even create an addiction. This is what we've seen with streaming services, for example, that are constantly pushed on people, which have led to a global pandemic, we can even call it, of overuse of streaming services, right? Justice. Will the act lead to a fair distribution of benefits and burdens? And the test here for justice is, will it be good for the least advantage? Yeah, this is called the Rolshan principle. For example, with poor people are sometimes the most affected by a change, right? So if you build a mall in a certain area, oftentimes the flow of water in that area will shift. Certainly, when the the MOA area was built out of reclaimed land, water shifted, and many neighboring subdivisions complained that flooding increased in their residences because water that used to go straight to the bay was not going straight to the bay anymore. It had to go somewhere. So therefore, was that just? So justice always has to look not only at the distributions of benefits, but to make sure that the least powerful people are not disadvantaged. By the way, this is one of the basis for ramps for disabled people in buildings, right? This is why anywhere you go in Hong Kong, even if you're blind, you can hear ticking sound so that you can know when to cross and so on. So we bend back a great deal for people who have less in life, and therefore that is the measure of a just society. So we don't measure a good society by the state of life of the most advantaged, of the richest. We measure the justice in a society by the life of the least advantage, and that's what justice is. Care is simply showing that kind of sensitivity to the people we have relationships with. Definitely, if we know that a person is a customer, that's why when banks, for example, offer financial services, whether these be loans or investment products, they have a principle which means know your customer. So you have to get to know your customer. For example, if you offer a loan, you have to know your customer. What is their lifestyle? What's their capacity to pay, and so on and so forth. Because sometimes these customers may not be able to pay, and therefore you'll need to restructure their loans so that you can help them out. But guess what? In many cases, banks that have pushed loans on people who actually did not even need those loans, or in some cases could not even afford to pay them long term. The moment they hit a rough spot and their loans have to be called in, many times banks will not even help them to restructure those loans. And that is a failure of care. Because why were you so eager to sell that to that person during the upside, but when he has a problem, you're nowhere to be seen? So a true caring person will also be there on the downside to support. And that's essentially an ethics of care. Even now, we teachers are faced with this issue, right? Because we have deadlines, we have requirements, but every time there is a storm or classes are called off, we have to recalibrate our requirements because students are really struggling now as they're taking their courses online. They're dealing with domestic situations at the same time. So teachers have to be very, very sensitive because there are a lot of mental health issues, concerns of young people about their future. They're really scared. So we have to be there to support them as they undergo this very difficult phase in their lives. Virtue has to do with character. When a person makes a decision, he has to ask himself, can I look at myself in the mirror if I do this? If I do this, am I a more trustworthy person? That's essentially what an ethics of virtue is. Because if I cannot even look people in the eye after I do this, maybe I shouldn't. And this is a very powerful measure of ethics. And finally, of course, I always mention this last, but this is the most popular among businesses. Now, this is the utilitarian principle, meaning you balance the good, as many good that will benefit, and then you deduct as many burdens as will result. And then if you have a total net benefit for as many people as possible, well, maybe that's the most ethical thing to do. My own stand on this is that I tend to favor the principle of virtue and dignity as the most important. followed by justice and rights, and then followed by care. And I tend to put utilitarianism at the very end, because the reason is utilitarianism tends to justify what we mean by the end justifying the means. So for example, if cities such as ours are guzzlers for power, right? Metro Manila guzzles so much power. Why? Because the average citizen has what, 2 to 3 cell phones. Even poor people have 2 cell phones, and all of these things have to be charged. Well, guess what? That power comes from dams. They come from uh, dams that are built in the lands of indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples who have been living there for thousands of years have to give up their culture, their land, so that the dams can supply the energy that is used by people in the lowlands, the cities such as ours. So these are real issues of justice, of virtue, of sustainability. And these decisions all have to be taken into account when even a person who is a data scientist has to make a decision. And finally, I said I wanted to touch on human development a little bit. This is this principle here. And for me, this is so important because when we make decisions, we look at human beings as really having different aspects of flourishing. The first is, of course, you have to make sure people have the essentials in life so that they can attend to their needs, food, shelter, and essentials. And as we said earlier, the storm has wrought so much havoc that so many are homeless. And this is a terrible thing. The most basic things that people need are food, shelter, and essentials. So, and as I said, when banks foreclose on properties, people lose their homes. And this is something that is essentially stripping them of their dignity. But beyond material goods, of course, important as they are, humans have to flourish. They have to be more than just surviving, because material goods only give us enough to survive. But actually, we have to be healthy. So health is extremely important. And here again, data plays a big part, because oftentimes when products and services are being pushed on people, it makes us overconsume, and overconsumption, either just staying late to binge on Netflix, or to buy that offer again in Lazada, even though we have 10 models of that already, affects our health. And it can make us really suffer in a big way down the road. Cognitive means people are flourishing when they understand and they reason. This is why consent is very important. Unfortunately, in software, for example, before you agree to be a member of a software service, you have to read this user's license. And oftentimes it's so long, nobody bothers to read it anymore, because it's really not designed to be read. It's written in such a boring way, nobody wants to read it, right? If I were the company, I would make that into an animated video explaining what those are, so that the one who says yes understand that this is what it means. If you say yes to this service, these are the possible risks. This is what you will do. Do you understand what this is all about? That's what we mean by helping people enhance their cognitive side. Emotional, this refers to building confidence and addressing anxieties. I think I mentioned earlier that we have an epidemic of mental health issues, especially among the young. I was in Sweden a couple of years ago, and even in that very progressive country, suicide rates are higher than ever, especially among the young. The reason, of course, partly is because of technology. Their overexposure technology lead them to keep comparing themselves against others, or they keep going for one more like, one more tweet, one more heart. It becomes an addiction. And all of this builds on their anxieties, and therefore their quality of life really just goes down the drain. For people to flourish, they also have to experience beauty. And this is where I think a lot of technology experience can actually help, right? Because we've had a lot of revolutionary changes in entertainment because of technology, and certainly those are experiences of beauty. But this has to be balanced in relation to everything else. Social connection. Now, this is something very, very close to my heart, because I remember before Facebook, people really knew how to have conversations. And I'm a very social person. I like having long talks with people, which is why Doc mentioned that we have long conversations because I'm a lover of conversation. But guess what? When Facebook and social media came around, the first thing that died was conversations. Now people have very little time to really spend on substantive conversations. And actually, paradoxically, even though social media was intended to connect people, if it's not used properly, it actually disconnects people. So it's not uncommon to see a family of five in a fast food restaurant, but none of them are talking to each other. They're all in their cell phone talking to others who are not physically present. And this is standard situation now. So families really have to reassert certain values, and this is what flourishing means. This happens in the workplace too. In some offices, if you enter the office and say hello to people, very few will even look away from their email or Facebook to say hello to you. You can do that as an experiment. I do it all the time, and I'm happy if I get one response out of 10. Moral, this is of course the capacity to distinguish right from wrong. So the reason I spend a lot of time on this is because for me, this is our ultimate defense. Because by some estimate, 50% of jobs will be taken over by artificial intelligence, robotics, big data, neural networks, all of this within the next 5 years, right? So the question that is always foremost in my mind is, how will this lead to human flourishing? How will the takeover of maybe routine or repetitive tasks enable people to do the things that they do best, which is actually all of this? What people do best is connect with each other, to empathize with each other, to have a sense of purpose, which is the last one here, to have a sense of meaning. And so maybe the drudgery can be taken away because robots will do it, right? But what happens to all of those who will lose their jobs? How will they meet their basic needs? So this is the dilemma that faces us. The goal is really to improve the lives of people, and that's what technology should be doing. But let's face it, 90% of the patents of all advanced technologies are owned by the top billionaires in the world. And are we hoping that they will use all of that patents to serve the common good so that humans will flourish? Well, that's a big hope. Let's hope that happens. Certainly, one of my heroes is uh, the developer of HTML, because when he developed HTML, Tim Berners-Lee, he did not patent it. He said, this will be my gift to the world. That's why when the World Wide Web was born, anyone can use HTML, anyone can use HTTP because he did not patent any of it. He felt that everyone had the right to access information instantly, to offer a picture that can be accessed by anyone in the world instantly. So hopefully all the others will use that, right? But I think he himself did not predict all of the negative effects that overuse of the web or abuse of the web has wrought on people. So if we put this together, therefore, the company becomes a distributor of human development. So if we look at this flower as every human being, the goal of a company is to make sure that all of these individuals flourish, starting from the employees, the customers, the suppliers of credit and equity, of course, the young people through the environment and society as a whole. In effect, a business is like a cell site. It's a cell site distributes signal to everyone, right? A business should distribute welfare to everyone. It must enhance the lives of everyone it touches. Unfortunately, in reality, there are biases in the way businesses are done. Normally, the bias is for two groups. And normally, these two groups, let me just exit from here. These two groups are the customers and the investors. Meaning to say, customers get the lower price, accessible, and highly advanced products and services. And the investors get the net profit and the share price appreciation. But often, this comes at the expense of all the other stakeholders. Employees will sometimes lose the security of tenure, benefits, even health and safety. Suppliers will tend to get paid late. The environment will tend to be despoiled because of pollution. Government will lose taxes because of tax evasion. Creditors will also not have transparent repayment. And this is a tendency. This is why ethics is extremely important. And guess what? All professionals, whether they're lawyers, uh, accountants especially, are often, if they don't speak up, misused by a business to enable this kind of abuse. Accountants and lawyers, for example, are often engaged in a lot of scandals because they violate their professional oath. Of course, engineers sometimes, no? When you have a condominium development which is not yet ready, but it's already turned over to the buyers, even though there are serious safety features, an engineer had to sign. And the owner will push the engineer to sign because they have to move to the next project. So this is a challenge. No? So what we would like is this to achieve development of everyone. But often what we have is this, which is why professionals are like the knights. If you remember the Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, they are the vanguard that defends the welfare of human beings. That's why they're given special skills. And their special skills should be at the service of the common good. So I'd like to pause here for the ethics side, and maybe Doc, if you have some initial insights or even some questions on this first part of my presentation.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot to unpack, and actually, I was just thinking out loud. No, we've never really had since we've started these podcasts, kind of a session. I was telling you about this when we did the pre-chat. No, we never really had a session to talk about kind of the ethics 101. So I think this is a great opportunity to just get back to basics, and obviously the basics aren't that basic. So many things to react to. Maybe the first thing I want to kind of call out is data science curricula nowadays, no? And I think you pointed this out in when you talked about the APEC. Although it's there, the word ethics is buried under one subtopic, like 21st century skills, and I find that it's very telling on how much value, or I don't know if it's accidental or intentional, how much value the prevailing mindset around data and analytics puts on ethics. It's kind of an afterthought, I mean, to put it bluntly. And even talking about curricula, like I co-developed a business analytics curricula for a university. I think we were trailblazing in the sense that very few schools who are teaching data science and analytics actually have an ethics subject, and we insisted in UANP to have two. No, one talking about the human, basically looking at data as a reflection of humanity. No, the human centric
Wonderful.
view. Yeah. And then
Yeah.
there's then another topic of proper business ethics, and I still think that's not enough. you know
Yes,
and,
yes.
and you mentioned also, diba, in your sixfold framework, utilitarianism is kind of on the bottom, no? And I think if there's anything, if anything, that's actually the opposite of how data science works, no?
Yes.
Data science is very utilitarian. Even the people, the kinds of skills they teach you, it's all about minimizing or maximizing a loss function or a cost function. So inherently, it's very utilitarian. And if we're not careful, because I also come from a finance background, so I can relate this to kind of my own experience in finance and then now in data science. In finance, the bad habit, I'll call it a bad habit, that you're taught is everything can be reduced to economic terms. No?
Yes,
So if,
yes.
so if you suffer a damage, we'll pay for it.
Yes.
Or somebody dies, we'll pay for it. Or you lost an opportunity, we'll pay for it. So basically, pretty much the entire edifice of finance is built on quantifying in economic terms, purely economic terms, which I think is quite naive. And I think
And
that's where the
dangerous.
problem. Yeah, that's where the problem starts.
Yeah, yeah.
I would totally agree. So that's one thing I want to call out. It's ethics is an afterthought. Data science and using also finance as another example is highly utilitarian. So the mindset you develop is very utilitarian. And then maybe the other thing I want to call out as well, it's kind of maybe underneath all of this, and maybe you'll tackle this in your second part, no? I think there's also a question about um, what is the inherent ethics of a technology, no? Because I also hear some tech people claim that technology is agnostic. You know, it only becomes like good or evil the moment you use it, and I used to believe that actually, but and you brought this up when you talked about social media that was originally meaning to connect people, essentially, but now the way it's designed actually ends up dividing us, no?
Yes.
So I feel that there must have been an error of design there somewhere
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that kind of misses the point, no?
Yeah.
And now it's an ethical question. And then again, I'll call out another elephant in the room, unless I'm really wrong. But generally, I find that data people in general, data scientists, data analysts, data engineers, usually are very reluctant to talk about ethics in politics. Not because they're unethical, but either they're ill-equipped maybe, or they're not familiar with it. Maybe it's the utilitarianism, prevailing utilitarianism. And I think by this time, it's becoming obvious to a lot of people. When it dawned on me, that's the reason why we formed data ethics, is you cannot divorce the political impact of data. Now, when you do data work, it is inherently political, even if the subject matter is not political. The act of putting data together and putting an analysis out there at the behest of someone, whether it's your boss or your organization, the government, it has political ramifications, no? And then
Definitely.
all the way to the very extreme version, which is, I guess, an election where the data is politics per se, no?
Mm.
Uh, so that's a reality where you have people who are maybe in denial of the true nature of their work, and I don't know if there is a common ground that we can find, no?
Well,
Because yeah.
yeah, I think there is, and I'm really glad that you outlined those reactions, and I think the way forward, and I'll tackle the points you mentioned in turn. Ano.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really encouraged by this actually, this visual, and I think I mentioned to you informally that the first solution is just to transfer this from the last to the first,
Yep.
because everything I'm talking about is here. Critical thinking, which is essentially questioning our assumptions, right? Social and societal awareness. This is why I talked about the common good, the constitution, the role of business in society. In other words, if you are a data professional and you know your role in an organization, and you know the role of that organization in a community, and you know the role of that community in the bigger project of nation building, you see how important you are. That is why you have those skills. It is for a purpose that you have those skills. And therefore, the assumption there is that you will commit that gift to a purpose bigger than yourself. Of course, if you switch to the dark side, as they say, and you become a mercenary, then that's where the danger starts, right? That's why even in the hacking field, you have the reds and the... So the thing here is that the elements are already in place, and we just need to call attention to them. And I think you're right. If the past webinars have focused mainly on the technical and the non-ethics side, now is the time to give more to that item 10. On the deep question that you asked about the role of technology, and this was my opening spiel actually. Because of the advances of technology, people are thinking that maybe technology is always exempt from the existing ethical principles, because after all, they're just simply tools, right? But this is the biggest fallacy. Because remember, whatever tool you make, the bigger question, and you mentioned this, is about power, meaning who will use the tool? Well, even more fundamentally, who can afford to pay the tool so that he will have exclusive use of the tool? Now, a tool is perfect if you can make sure that it cannot be used against others, and if you will use it against them, they can use it to defend themselves against you. But in reality, that is never the case. If I pay somebody to design even in the medical field, for example, an American pharmaceutical company will go to some deep part of the Amazon and talk to some tribal people and discover that they have this herbal medicine that they have been using for maybe 1,000 years. And then they will extract the active ingredient and then patent it and now sell it over the counter and make billions out of that drug. And they don't even stop there. They go back to the tribal people and say, you cannot use this anymore because we patented it. So you might say, well, a medicine is just a tool. But in this particular case, that medicine was used to practically destroy that indigenous culture and to privatize something which was a common good. So therefore, if you're the biochemical expert that extracted that chemical from those plants, you have to ask yourself, should I be doing this? This is something that is culturally embedded in the life of these people for more than 1,000 years, and I'm now extracting it without their consent. And worse, it will not even benefit them. So we cannot separate a discussion of deciding to create a tool with particular features we cannot separate that from the question of who will have access to the tool, who will have power to use the tool, and who will have the transparency to understand how the tool works. And this is, I think you mentioned a key phrase earlier. This has to be considered at the level of design. Any tool must incorporate into the design transparency on its purpose, how it will use, and then accountability, meaning anyone who has the power to use it must be held accountable to society. Nobody should be above the law, right? Because that's the problem. If you're a Google or a Facebook, you can always say, well, my algorithms are my intellectual property, so I can't show it to you. But wait, those tools affect my life. It's turning my children into addicts and neurotics. You better show me. But
Yeah, I agree.
unless people realize that they can actually just invoke justice. Children are weak. They cannot say no to a graphic that's dancing on screen or a meme that's being passed around. So they're obviously least advantaged. That's why in public television, there is a rating system. And there is a big push to introduce rating. Well, there's already a rating system for video games, right? But I think there should be a rating system for the internet as a whole because kids are exposed to them.
Yeah.
So if all of these principles are applied, we can see that any ethical question, no matter how advanced the technology is, reduces to the same principles. It's still rights, justice, dignity, character. And for me, it's sort of like a smokescreen if people think that these are merely, these questions now become exempt from the traditional values and virtues. That's my take on it. But I think those are very important questions that you should really keep raising in all of the forums that we will have in the future.
Yeah, and if I can add also, and this is something, frankly, that keeps me up at night sometimes. No? Like I said, I used to subscribe to that belief of the technology is agnostic until humans use it. But then if you consider any technology, any system, any mechanism, you're if you think about it really deeply, what you're doing is you're reducing a utility to a very fixed set of outcomes. No? For example, what do you do with the ball pen? You can write with it, but you can also stab someone with it.
Yes, yes, definitely.
So there's a range of outcomes.
Yes.
So but maybe in the case of the ball pen, it was not intended for stabbing, but you can use it to stab. So maybe the pen is maybe falls in the middle, no? It's how you use the pen. But there are technologies that have a very defined set of outcomes, and all of them are adverse, like weapons, and obviously gun rights is another issue that
Yes,
continues
yes.
to plague societies. But then, okay, guns are explicit. Then we go to data. The challenge I'm seeing with data is we are at the threshold where, because of data, you are on the verge of granting not just a fixed set of outcomes to mechanisms and systems, no, like a predictive algorithm will have a fixed set of outcomes, probabilistic, pero it's still fixed. And then later, automation will then take it to another level, because
Yes.
when do you decide when a machine has agency, no? Kasi right now we're still I mean, everything we've discussed on ethics centers in human beings making a
Yes.
decision to be ethical. But once you start birthing machines who make decisions based on whatever criteria or rules or algorithms, and you did not imbue the ethical framework into that, into that system, if it's possible to imbue, and then now you've created agents without ethics intentionally, and we're close to that. No,
And
we're seeing.
potential monsters, in effect.
Correct. And
Mm.
paano na, no? I mean, that's actually what bothers me, because now I'm more of a believer in technologies merely reflect the basically the nature of the makers. No? So you cannot really absolve any technology of any ethical challenge, because you are subject to ethical dilemmas.
Yeah,
and
precisely.
and it's also possible to be neglectful, no? If you ignore the ethical dimension, and you even accidentally create an unethical machine. For example, social media could be termed as such. No, I'm sure when the creators of Facebook and Twitter, they were just creating toys on the internet. They just wanted a place for people to share pictures and poke people around. And then it becomes a business, as you said, needs to be commercialized. People have to pay the bill. Advertising started becoming popular in social media, and I think that's where the needle turned, no? Because now you need to redesign the system to reward basically activity that promotes advertising, which is engagement. And then now, just like the ball pen example, a ball a ball pen can be used to stab, just like an advertisement can be used to promote fake news, or
That's right. Yeah.
diba? And engagement can be good or bad engagement. You can spread a lie and you get engaged with that lie, and you fulfilled the design of the system. I think that's something
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
it bothers a lot of people when you talk about it that way. There was that documentary called what was that? The Social Dilemma.
Yeah, I saw it
And
in Netflix. Yeah.
yeah, and the interviewees who used to work in Facebook and Google,
Yeah.
you could tell that they were reluctant to admit that they've
Yes.
created
Yes.
something that potentially unethical or potentially evil, no? But it's hard to reconcile if you're the maker. Like, why would I
Yes.
create
Yes.
something bad?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an error of design. Eh. Yun yung problem. Or is it really an error? No, maybe it was intentional, but they just didn't consider these six criteria when they were designing it. They were purely utilitarian, siguro.
Yeah.
Purely
Yeah.
utilitarian.
Well, I
You know.
think you that's a very good example. I think they were negligent. No? So they did not pose the question of virtue, right? Because when you use your skills in a way that is not prudent, in effect, you're selling out your skill to something that can harm others. That shows a lack of prudence. And when you now treat people as things, so well, actually, it's good that you cited social media, because the real history of Facebook was, it was a dorm game, right? They would rate the girls in terms of who was the most attractive or the least attractive. That is why it was called Facebook. They would get the in the Philippines we call them yearbooks, right? They call them Facebooks. And so from the get-go, it was really dorm ethics that dominated. I'm not really surprised that if you have a 19-year-old programmer who develops a software to rate women in terms of their looks and becomes CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world, the scandals that have bedeviled Facebook is not a surprise to me. Because from the get-go, the DNA of that company was not ethics. It was really using people as things.
Yeah, it's a
People,
popularity contest of some
yes,
sort.
exactly.
Yeah,
And based on that popularity, you extract profit from it.
yeah,
See? So you not only prostitute the person because you're treating him as a thing and you make money
effectively.
out of him, you essentially demean his dignity. So this is why I think the principles in this slide will really stand the test.
Mm-hmm.
And those guys who left those big companies were having a crisis of virtue. They could no longer look at themselves in the mirror because they felt that people who believed in them, with whom, who trusted them, no longer can rely on them. And you're right, they were probably saying, well, as long as the majority were benefiting from it, but what about the minority?
Yeah.
Because the minority have to be protected. See? So in any case that we see in the news, we can apply the same set of questions. And in fact, if we were to build sentient beings, or if we ever reach the point of singularity, and autonomous agents become self-aware, if they will just keep asking themselves these same questions, I think we have a better world. The question is, what answers will they generate when they ask these questions? So they will have to talk to each other, because I think that the questions, as long as we apply them in an iterative, reflective way, the thing with technology, though, it moves very fast. And prudence requires us not to move so fast. We need to be deliberate. Ethics and being deliberate are really good partners.
Yeah, somebody brought this up. I think it was forgot the guy's name. No, he he coined it Martek's law, no? Where
Mm.
you look at the speed of technology, which is the Moore's law, basically the
Yeah.
exponential curve,
Mm-hmm.
and then you juxtapose that. So no one debates Moore's law anymore.
Yes. Yeah.
Moore's law is both a function of physics and economics. No,
Yes.
the chips get smaller and they get cheaper. So yan
Yes.
yung exponential. But societies don't change exponentially. If ever, they're very flat, very linear. In other words,
Yes.
our cultural mores, our cultural attitudes, what's acceptable, hardly changes year on year. No, maybe it takes a decade. So by nature, you have that gap between the tech that has changed and then your society has not. So that's one issue. And then related to that, although there could be some hope, but let's just call it status quo for the moment. I'm also worried that the tools we have at our disposal to enforce all of this or to guard us, it's still basically carrot and stick. No, you have the
Yeah.
stick, which
Yeah.
is the law, and carrot, which is economics. And in both cases, the stick is so far behind
Yeah.
in terms of even articulating all these challenges.
Yes. Normally, it's about 10 years behind.
Yeah, at
Yeah.
least, no?
At least 10 years behind.
And then the economics naman, it gets ahead of itself. It rewards this
Yeah.
moral hazards, no? So,
Because it's utilitarian.
very utilitarian,
Yes.
and that's what continues to encourage the
Yes. Yes.
development of all these.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
a double paradox is that's also what makes these developing technologies possible.
Yes. Yes.
If it was not profitable, why would people do it?
Yes. So it
So
fuels innovation in a way.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that's what makes it murky. No, you don't want
Yeah.
to switch off the faucet, because otherwise society will not evolve.
Yes. Yes.
But at the same time, you're rewarding by switching it on. You're also rewarding the bad behavior.
Yes. Yes. And,
So
and this is why you hit the nail on the head, Doc. This is why I believe the only socially sustainable solution is to professionalize it.
yeah,
Because in any other field of endeavor, for example, medicines are technologies, but they can be used as narcotics, right? That's why you had to introduce two professions, the medical doctor and the pharmacist. It is the role of these two sets of professionals to make sure that society benefits from the advances in medical technology. We did not say, oh, ban medicines. We said, look, we need people who are specialized, meaning they're competent, but they must take an oath. They must take a pharmacist should not give medicine unless there is a prescription, right? So the same is true. So my vision is in the future, an algorithmic designer will be licensed, and therefore when a business asks him, okay, your database, your name appears in this database of designers of neural networks and deep learning algorithms, can you design this for me? That's the equivalent of a pharmacist. Because in the old days, a pharmacist will even mix the compounds for you and mix it and then give it to you. But he will only do that with a prescription. See?
yeah,
So you're right. We have to be careful not to turn off the faucet, because we do need the advancement. And we need it so that human beings can be rid of drudgery and misery. Once we rid people of drudgery and misery, then we can all flourish. That's why the proposal now in many of the advanced countries is a universal basic income, a UBI,
To compensate.
to make sure everybody has the minimum income for a dignified life, because everybody will lose jobs because of the
Yeah.
acceleration of technology. But if you have UBI, then we can all concentrate. You and I can talk poetry and philosophy the whole afternoon,
and
Doc,
and still survive.
and we will still survive. And why not?
Yeah.
Why not?
Correct.
Because we have developed such advanced technologies, so it will serve us. But what is happening now is, as I said, 90% of the patents are owned by billionaires. And they will use it to build more and more commercially intensive technologies that will continue to treat human beings as data points and data points as things for the maximization of profit. That is why the questions here have to be continuously raised. Now, who will raise these questions among the data professionals? Only those who are trained in ethics. Otherwise, the answer is, well, when do you want it, boss? If you give me a task, the question of the mercenary is, when do you want it?
Becomes utilitarian pa
It
rin, no?
becomes
Oo.
precisely utilitarian.
It brought to mind, I think I shared this with you. I was invited to a data privacy conference, and I think it was one of the first ones, no, about maybe 2 years ago, I think. And I think I was the only data among the speakers. No? I was the only data specialist. Everyone was either a compliance or a law, a lawyer, regulators, and I guess that was the context, right? I might have been accidentally invited to provide the kind of the context of the analytics industry, and I was actually pretty, in a way, pretty adamant when I took the floor, and I said, how can you get away with the data privacy conversation without the participation of the people who are most likely going to violate your privacy, which are the people handling the data themselves, no? The data engineers, the data scientists. It actually against more privacy regulation actually hampers their work, because part of analytics is looking at interrelationships between data points,
Yes.
and what you aim to do is to mask those data points or to prevent access to them. So inherently, it's in
At cross
opposition.
purposes. At cross
Oh,
purposes, yeah.
So, well, anyway, long story short, I think that's also another challenge with this phenomena of data and ethics, is that we suffer again with another thing you brought up, which is another island or a silo of expertise. And so now you have DPOs, data privacy officers, has another silo, who are not talking to the data analyst, who is
Yes.
another silo. And again, and probably both of them don't talk to the original silo, which is IT,
Yes. Yes.
and that's the problem. No, there's no cross-disciplinary conversation, cross-disciplinary discussion.
And the more that happens, Doc, the more ethical issues arise.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if you use the medical analogy you mentioned, no, in bioethics, even within the medical profession, there are silos, but
Yes.
at least they seem to be making an effort to have a more, in a way, cross-disciplinary conversation.
Yes. Because they've developed protocols for that.
Yeah.
They now have automatic triggers for when they need to bring in another specialist.
Tama.
And this is a conservative position that doctors take.
Mm.
They already have sort of a red flag when they know, oops, it's touching into an area that's not my specialty. So I'm ethically bound to bring one more person in.
I think, yeah, you just reminded me of another Pandora's box that, okay, I'm just going to open it. No. So on the one hand, you talk about professionalizing data science or data analytics. And again, you notice I keep vacillating between those two, because those two terms can't seem to agree, which is which, no? Which is the superset or the subset? Is data science the superset? Analytics is the subset. Okay, so there's that parang vacillating identity. And then now, talking about silos and expertise, the problem, another problem I see is, because the practice of data science and or analytics, which is at the core, a lot of it is statistics, no? Statistics and
Yeah.
applied math. is actually a toolkit of many other professions.
Yes.
The physics people, the industrial engineers, the computer scientists, the statisticians, they all use the same or very, very similar tools. So now we have a situation where uh, people from all these various,
Fields.
fields are now going into industry, which
Yes.
which was previously kind of dominated by the usual suspects: marketing people, finance people, ops people, and now you have physicists working in marketing, you have statisticians working in finance.
Yes. Yes.
So the point now is there's actually even a subtle disagreement on who is really the real data scientist, on who is really
Yes.
the
Yes.
real data analyst,
Mm.
because everyone wants to stake a claim that that's our field. We
Yes.
studied that in school, and even data science itself keeps expanding. So now it's gone beyond the usual statistical modeling, regression, and
Yes.
all these stuff. It's now including other disciplines such as
Mm.
mapping,
Yeah.
geospatial,
Yeah.
which was previously the domain of mga geographers, geologists, and climatologists.
Yeah.
It's also getting into network science, which was also another domain of network engineers. Even physics calls it complex systems, so a lot of
Yes.
networks
Yes.
happen there.
Mm.
So ang dami, no? It's becoming now this
Yeah. Yeah.
parang chop suey of stuff. So never mind agreeing on an ethical framework. Everyone seems to be disagreeing on,
Yes. Yes.
may minutia. They're disagreeing on
Yes.
subtleties.
Yes. Yes.
And then I don't think we've had a better example of that than the 2020 pandemic, because now
Yes.
you
Yes.
have another previously quiet field, which is
Yes.
epidemiology,
Yes.
which is a
Yes.
subset of maybe the health field. But they also do a lot of these models. Suddenly they're out in the open, and then everyone else is suddenly an epidemiologist. Now
Mm.
everyone's now calling out,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're flattening the curve, we're not flattening the
Yes.
curve,
Yes.
and even economists are coming into the fray, talking about
Mm.
the cost of flattening the curve, or the trade-off between more cases versus lower GDP. So wow, no, I think
Yeah.
this is really hit a fever pitch as far as I'm concerned,
Yeah. Yeah.
in terms
You're
of
right. And I think this is a good framing for the second part of my pitch, and you will remember that that's why when I framed my perspective, I really started from that. No, the advances have made sophistication more and more, leading to specialization, and this will happen even more. So if you think we have 100 islands now, in 5 years there will be 1,000 islands. This is going to continue. That's why my framing is that I address this to everyone who is involved in the production and use of data. This is the biggest umbrella that I feel needs to be addressed. And the thing that will stitch them all together is common principles of ethics. When I speak of common principles of ethics, of course, I refer to what I just shared, which can now be applied to subspecialties. But these should be mother principles. Whichever branch of the subspecialty you are in, just like doctors, there are already more than 100 specialties in medicine, but all of them still abide by the Hippocratic Oath, because that should be non-negotiable, which is, first of all, do no harm. That's the first principle, primum non nocere. Now, the other thing, and this is now what leads to the data aspect, the subspecialties, and why it's so important. I think we need to start from a fundamental understanding of what is data, because often what is debated is certain types of data, usually machine-readable data. But actually, in the biggest sense, that is not a very accurate definition of data. I prefer to use Leonelli's definition of data. Data are objects that are treated as potential or actual evidence for scientific claims. When I speak of scientific claims, either whether something exists or not, or whether something affects another thing or not. So these are the two broad types of scientific claims. And such data must be amenable to being scrutinized and accounted for. So everything that falls under this definition, for me, has the potential for good, which we have already described, but which also has the potential for abuse. That's why they need professionals to be caretakers. So in the same way that 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 engineers have to take care of buildings and bridges because they can protect people, but they can also kill people, right? Doctors have to take care of medicines for the same reason. They can protect and kill. Data professionals, in the true sense, must be able to take care of data. They must have the principles so that they can be caretakers of data and to make sure that they're properly nurtured and properly used. So because when we interact with data, they begin to describe the world. This is why data is so powerful. They, they picture the world for us. Data are not the world. They are parts of a picture of the world. And although we prefer to interact with the world directly, but as I said, when managers have to deal with so many units or branches, instead of visiting the branches, they just interact with the dashboard, showing which branch is making more money. So if one branch is not making money, so the boss can call the manager of the branch and say, hey, what are you doing there? You lazy bums, you're not meeting quota. And I call that managing by remote control, no? Like playing a video game. Because in the old tradition in management, what you would do is visit that branch and say, hey, how can I help here? How come our sales are a bit low? What's your take? Then you have a conversation. But the moment people think that the graphs in their smartphone is reality, this is where the violation of human rights happen. This is the danger that I see when data are used by people who are not close to the domains. No? So therefore, under this very broad definition, data can either be digital, and for the most part, this is what we talk about, but actually data can also be physical, right? So because they are really a footprint of a specific interaction with the world. And because when we produce data, this is part of capturing features of the world. So one of the original sources of data gathering, which you already cited in the case of GIS information, is actually photography. So when you take a picture, that was data capture. And now, of course, we convert that to pixels, and literally they are now digital information, which appears like pictures. So all of this, therefore, is a broad sense of what is data. And so when we look at that, I remember during the global financial crisis, some financial modelers, I respect these two guys, Derman and Wilmot. They're physicists, they're engineers, but they're also in finance, and they use very advanced math. And they saw how much math was abused, which caused the global financial crisis. We will remember that during the global financial crisis, about 40% of global capital just evaporated. That's 40%. That's trillions upon trillions of dollars. 5 European countries went bankrupt. So there, of course, some say the pandemic might equal that. So only time will tell. But that was really a major uh, disaster. And part of what triggered that was a misuse of mathematical models. The value at risk model, the Gaussian copula model, all of these are very elegant models which were put in the wrong hands. And they were used in ways that really led business leaders to make very reckless decisions. That's why after the global financial crisis, these two guys came together and said, we should make something like a Hippocratic oath. Just like the Hippocratic oath that doctors take. And I'm sharing it here because I think this is something that data professionals should do. And this is what they said. I will remember that I did not make the world, and it doesn't satisfy my equations. So this emphasizes that the world is the world, and an equation is simply an attempt to capture relevant parts of the world. It is not the world. But a lot of people, when they interact with models, they think they're interacting with the world, and this is the first problem. Though, and this is where we say, let's not turn off the faucet. No, we still need the models because they give us things that can help us. I will use models boldly to estimate value. He's referring here, of course, about the value of stocks and bonds and other marketable securities. But I will not be overly impressed by mathematics. And this goes to your point about sometimes people use knowledge like a bludgeon. They beat other people over the head with it. But actually, the role of knowledge is to uplift people, to improve the quality of life. Obviously, if it becomes a huge ego trip, then that's where the danger happens, which is again a virtue issue. If somebody thinks that because he has advanced mathematics, he somehow has the vision of God on the world, then you're in danger, right? Whether it's a mad genius making Frankenstein, or it's a data analytics guy or a finance guy. This for me is very important. I will never sacrifice reality for elegance without explaining why I have done so. So we are acknowledging that modeling involves some simplification. So if I compute my GPA to compute my average grade to show my parents, it's a summary. But if my parents insist, okay, well, I don't care about the average, I want to see the individual grades. And if you're a wise parent, that's what you should insist, right? Some parents just look at the GPA and give you a bonus or whatnot. So they may not know that you have maybe 170 and several 90s. So they will not know that you have a 70 because you have a high average. But a caring parent should. I want to see all the grades. Because if you simplify something, you're throwing away information. So there has to be a very good reason to do that. So when the government cites 16.6% poverty rate and does not show the poverty map, for me, that's unethical. That poverty map should be made public. Everybody should see the poverty map because it tells us the situation in this country that a 16.6 average doesn't show. Nor will I give the people who use my model false comfort about its accuracy. Instead, I will make it explicit in terms of its assumptions and oversights. Accountants do this all the time. They have the notes to the financial statements. Unfortunately, this is not standard practice in data, among data activities. No, oftentimes, well, there was some debate in the last Pulse Asia. You will be aware of this, Doc, right? There was a Pulse Asia survey where our sitting president garnered about 90+% approval. So there was a big debate about this. But as Pulse Asia said, anyone can go to the website and see the design. And I looked at the design, and the design is sound. But the important thing is this. Is it the case that what people say in a survey really explains what is happening in the country? That is another matter. But I have no doubt that that is really what the people said. How we interpret what they say is something that a statistician cannot help us with. You need psychologists and sociologists and political scientists for that. Statisticians only give you the numbers based on the rules of estimation. And they have to tell you how precise those numbers are, or for that matter, how imprecise. And finally, I understand that my work, and this for me is the ultimate measure of a professional, to understand that their work has enormous effects on society and the economy, and many of them beyond their comprehension. So when people make pronouncements, and I've seen this in some of your podcasts, people kind of backpedaling on some of the things they announce, that's only responsible. But maybe I would suggest that in the future, when we announce anything, we already include all of the qualifiers as part of the announcement, because that's what professionals do. Because they already warn people, just like when you take your medicine, if you look at the literature that comes with your medicine, there is that square that says contraindications. Not to be taken when you're driving, or not to be taken when you're pregnant, whatever. So statistics are like that, not to be believed when you are crazy. So there has to be a label like that. So I think this is a very important step that potential data professionals can do. They can come together, the entire family, all of those people you mentioned, all of those subgroups you mentioned. I think there should be a summit, and they should realize that their time has come. Literally, the 21st century is literally the information age. And therefore, anyone that deals with the production, the interpretation, the storage, the transmission of data, they are extremely important to society. So the sooner we can get them to realize their importance, that is how we can protect ourselves from the damage, but also maximize the potential good. So therefore, what tempers this, I think, because this is for me part of what will temper the data science of it. But I think we need to look also at the science of it. And this is what I want to focus on in the next set of slides. Scientists have a very specific approach to modeling because they understand that a model is a metaphor. A metaphor is you're making a comparison with reality. You want to understand reality, but you just want to capture it in a metaphor so that you highlight certain features of that reality. And therefore, once you highlight those features, as called abstraction and analogy, you can now use reasoning about the world. So the key question when you do models, therefore, is not whether the model is good or bad, but whether the model allows us to reason well. Does it allow us to reason well within its intended domain? The problem is a lot of models are taken from its original domain, transferred to another domain where it was not intended to be used because there were no notes that came with it. The model should have come with notes that this is to be used, just like medicines, right? This is not to be used by pregnant women. It's there. The problem is models are highly portable, easy to transmit. You know, you can download an R module or any Python module, and then it doesn't say not to be, not to be, don't do this at home or something like that. So this question is the essential scientific question with a model. So if we look at it, we can start with the simplest model. One of the simplest models, of course, is a street map. And you mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the domain of geologists, right? Geologists look at earth structures and try to understand it. And if we were moving around in a city, of course, we're interested in the city. But if our purpose is to move around the city, this is not a very useful view of the city, right? But this is actually a more realistic view of the city. But instead, we model it. So a map is actually a model of the city. We just get the features that we want from it for our purpose, because our purpose is to find the most efficient way to get from point A to point B and always know where we are. That's why the street names are important. Here, we don't see the street names. And of course, we have no sense of distance here. So this comparison, these spatial relationships is what we try to capture here. So what is important in the modeling here are the spatial relationships. Because from here, we can now answer the question, what is the fastest way to move from here to here? We can infer that feature from the map. So if in the map we say, oh, the fastest way from here to there is I take a right here, then a left here, then I go straight, and then turn a left there. That's our inference from the map. And then we now say that that route, right, left, right, straight, right, left, transfers to the actual city. So we're making a lot of inferences here. And in science, we need to be very careful because we can easily lose our way in all of this inference when we think we're dealing with the reality, but we forgot that we made inferences. In fact, in this particular case, we made at least 3 inferences, although he mentions 2 here. For me, even this is an inference. But what if the model, well, so that's called the modeling relationship now. So here we have the model, and then here we have the world. So this is the general task of science, because the goal of science is to understand the world, to explain what happens in the world, and then to do things that affect the world. But since we don't always have the luxury of doing that directly to the world, we try to do it by understanding them through models. So therefore, how good a model is, whether it's a map model or any other model, depends on the kind of questions we intend to ask. And often this is not well explained in the data activities. Now, even statisticians sometimes confuse themselves with the questions that they're asking. So this has to be very clear. So our reasoning must depend on the similarities between the model and the world. So this is the first thing. So if this is similar to this in terms of relative distance, then the map works. Because our question is, what is the fastest way to go there, right? But if this is different from this in an important way, for example, we must be indifferent to the differences between the model in the world so that we can ignore them. For example, this map does not show which street is one-way or two-way. So in that way, it doesn't capture a very important part of the real world, right? So if you're driving and you just follow this map, well, you can get in trouble because it does not reflect what is one-way or what is two-way. Or if there are, if there's a construction here or there are huge, uh, you know, potholes here. That's also not in the map. So if you go rushing there, yeah, you'll hit into construction, or you'll break your tires in a pothole because it's not captured. So there are two assumptions there. Your assumption that the similarities that are all that matters, and you're assuming that the differences do not matter in the particular context you're in. So already we're introducing the importance of assumptions. And I'm just highlighting that the assumptions here have to do with the difference between the model and reality. Because oftentimes, especially statisticians, we speak of assumptions in terms of the scale of measurement, in terms of the normality of distributions. These are, for me, second order assumptions. I'm talking about fundamental assumptions about the difference between the model and the world. Now, enter equations, because this is another level of modeling and they're more abstract than physical maps. So, but the logic is the same. For example, in Business 101, we are taught our first model. It's the accounting equation. And this is an algebraic equation. Assets equals liabilities less owner's equity. And then, of course, this is the balance sheet. And this is the income statement. Net income is revenues less expenses. These are equations. But the reality we're interested in is really the economic status of a business. So this was developed, in the 1500s by a monk. And, the monk actually developed this system because of the funding of expeditions. It's like Magellan coming to the Philippines. But it had such a durable life. So now what the monk developed more than 500 years ago is still being used. That is why it also has a lot of problems, because it's really a very, very old way of modeling a business. And sometimes it creates more problems than reality. For example, assets. If you look at the balance sheet, the most important asset of any business is not reflected there. And of course, I'm talking about the true creators of value in a business, the human beings. The human beings in a business do not appear in the balance sheet. Now look at the income statement. If you look at the expenses, the pollution that is created by businesses are not included there. That's why we say that the expenses are externalized, because that's a real cost, but somebody else pays for it. So what government tries to do is capture a lot of that and charge it back to the company, either through taxes or penalties. But actually, that was an expense. If the business is thinking straight, it understands that if it's destroying the environment around it, it is slowly destroying itself. But the income statement doesn't show that. So that's a problem with this equation. Of course, more into familiar territory, we talk about statistical models. So a regression equation like this is supposed to capture causal effects, let's say, of advertising and distribution on business sales. And regression is the most popular tool. Many of my students use regression like they're breathing air. And I always tell them, you have to be very careful. A regression equation is a model. It is not the reality. What you're really interested in is the reality. So you can use the model as a tool to help you understand reality, but don't use the model as a substitute for your understanding. In fact, I often make my students do simulations, and I have here a few simulations that I want to use. Okay. All right, so this is an example of a simulation. So we have here data points, and I've converted just to reflect the previous slide where you have this. Okay, so when I now say show the regression line, there it is. So it computes a regression.
Mm.
And then, of course, I say use the data so that it converts the sales there. Now here, if I say show the significance,
Mm.
the statistical significance. So here, my students will right away say, okay, so sir, we can see right away that advertising is statistically significant because this P is less than 0.05. And
Mm.
then that's when our dialogue begins. So what does that actually mean?
Mm.
And then they say, well, sir, if I want to increase sales, so I spend this much on advertising. And how are you able to conclude that? Because that's what the regression line says. But I ask them, okay, but look at this line. What do you notice about the line? One of the most obvious thing you will notice about the line is that none of the points actually fall on the line. Not a single one. Well, guess what? Because the line is a mean. A regression line is a mean. And as I already said, the mean doesn't mean anything.
Mhm.
So be very careful when you interpret this to mean that to achieve this, I will do this. That's not what it means. It just means that assuming certain things, the data points tend to cluster around this line. So you have to ask yourself, if you're talking about a cluster, how does that apply to an individual? Often, it doesn't apply at all. In fact, when you apply something on the aggregate to an individual case, that is called the fallacy of division. For
Mhm.
example, if you say Japan is a rich country, therefore every Japanese is rich. Obviously, that's a fallacy, right? But the fallacy of division is common when we're talking about aggregates. That's why for me, every time students report a regression result to me, I always say, I want to see the scatter plot. Always, I insist. I want to see the scatter plot. I will not be impressed with a p less than 0.05, even a p less than 0.0001. That's not impressive to me because we're dealing with the reality. The reality are the points themselves. And of course, we're even assuming that the points actually represent reality, which is a big, big assumption. So we can see there that the regression line is a model, but the model is very, very, very far from the world because it took two steps to the regression. First, the scatter plot. And in the scatter plot, we're even assuming that the points were accurately collected. We're even assuming that these are clean data, right? And that is a big assumption because we know that in surveys, a lot of dirty data come in. But assuming they're clean, then we say we can make inferences based on the line that can now apply to individual data points. And that, again, is a very dangerous thing. So that has to be handled with utmost care. Therefore, this brings us into the dangers of mathematical and statistical models. So they're very useful, definitely, but they have some dangers. Just like medicines. Medicines are useful, but they have some dangers. That's why you need professionals to make sure that they are being checked and used properly. First is the risk of oversimplification. Because to make equations solvable, you remove important aspects of reality. But what happens if what you remove is the most important thing? That's a problem. Who is to decide whether what you're removing is important or not? This is not a decision for a data person to do. This is a decision for a domain expert to do. So a data person should be working with a domain expert. So if a data person is working on marketing, he should be working with the marketing person. Or better yet, the customer should be right in front of him. That way, he will have a sense of, well, does this make sense? Should I put this in? Should I remove this? Or should I model if there's a lag, right? So as we saw in the case of accounting equation, human capital is not there. Well, guess what? That's how they taught in the 1500s. This is the 21st century, but the accounting system is still the same. Hello. And then time lags in regression. Because in regression, we almost always assume instantaneous impact when actually we know that there's a lag in reality. Further problems with statistical models. We assume linearity, which means we can add things together. Like in this case, we're adding x1 and x2. That assumes linearity. When actually, many factors are not linear, which means they tend to affect each other. A good example of this is net profit. So for example, this is a highly simplified equation, right? Revenue less expenses is net income. This is actually not true in reality because we know that expenses cannot simply be taken away to increase net income. This is not true because actually any business knows that you need to spend to make money. So actually the true relationship for revenue and expenses is more of multiplication. But the multiplier is unknown. You have to determine it. But in accounting, it's very difficult to implement that. So we implement this highly simplistic equation. That's why when companies think short term and they want to increase their net income, they say, oh, cut expenses, which is not true. Because if what you cut is the most important thing, you lose even more revenue. Any businessman knows that. But accounting is its own field, so it insists on representing it that way.
Can I donate a slide to you?
Sure, sure, please. Are you able
Uh,
to send it now?
Wait. I'll share it briefly and then I'll email it to you now because
Okay.
this thing just brought up, and I think you'll find this as perfect examples now. I always use these two diagrams when talking about a similar topic. No?
Okay, there you
So,
go.
so this thing on the right, I love this because this is basically the story of every forecast. No,
The
so
sigmoid curve.
it's a sigmoid curve, but at any given point, in that
Yeah,
curve,
yeah, yeah.
the forecast, which is the red line, was
Yes,
wrong.
yes, yes, yes.
And I think this talks to your point about models are representations,
Yes, yes.
but you never really know the real phenomena. No, you're only approximating it,
Yes.
or you know it after the fact. No, for example,
Yes.
in this curve, you'll know it to be correct at when you already have all the data, and by that point, the forecast is useless because you've already enough time has transpired. This thing on the left, I think, is a more classical one. If you remember this,
I used
this
to
is
play that when I was a kid.
this is the geocentric model of the
Yeah,
solar
yeah.
system. No?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, when
Ptolemy.
yeah, and
Ptolemaic model.
and the thing about this is it's actually mathematically correct.
Yes, yes.
If you do assume the Earth is in the center of the universe, or at least the solar system,
The math works out. Yeah.
the math is absolutely correct and
Yeah.
the calculus works out, but the assumption is wrong. Now, I think this
Yes,
talks to
yes.
your I think point again about assumptions, domain expertise. You cannot divorce the use of models from that.
Yes, yes.
And again, when the assumption was changed into heliocentricity, the math changed, but the same data exists, but now it's interpreted very differently. Now, all the planets revolve around the sun, no? And then the math checks out again. So that's the problem with
Yeah, yeah.
relying solely on the math or
Yes,
naively
yes.
on the
Naively.
math. The thing can't work out, no.
Yes, yes.
Anyway, sige, I'll send this to you. I think you'll find this useful.
Yeah, perfect.
I
Perfect.
just thought of
And if we
donating
can,
that.
yeah, yeah. And referring to that, you cite very important examples there. Because in the case of the Ptolemaic model, uh, the key there is that we always have to cross-check with observation, right? So when the observations were made more and more precise, and this is where Galileo had to move in because he was using the telescope.
Yeah, better tools.
Yes, and therefore it was less, although that's a challenge with astronomy, you're literally far from the thing, right? That's why for me, some managers now behave like astronomers. Eh. Ayaw na nila bumaba, no? Di na,
Correct.
so,
Observing from far away.
yeah, and now that they have their smartphones, they can be playing a round of golf and they think they're managing a business. Oh God, help us. So, but this is being fueled by a lot of these big data vendors that keep convincing these CEOs with big pockets that they can manage by remote control. This is really pretty scary stuff. So what Galileo did was really to engage the object itself. That's why when the Catholic Church was forcing him to recant, he said, okay, it did not move. And then when he was moving out, he whispered, yes, but it moved. So,
Yeah, and that's a political thing, right?
that's right. Yeah, it
Yeah,
was a protest.
yeah, and you have what's proven by evidence, but you can't talk about it
Yeah,
because
that's the politics of
you're
it.
going to you could get
Yes.
killed, no? And that's
And
another dimension in ethics that we need to
and
manage.
that's why you have professionals, because professionals are protected. Professionals are protected so that they can speak the truth.
Yeah.
You have a legal system. Well, now other countries have a whistleblower law, right? Our country still doesn't have a viable whistleblower law. It keeps being postponed. But once that's approved, professionals who speak up can finally speak up and say, well, the model needed an extra zero, but my boss said remove it. And so he was the one. He took over and removed it. I didn't sign off on that design. You know, this is what accountants do sometimes. They have to just say they quit, or they say I can't do that. You can, but you know, businesses can change their accountants anytime. There is no law against changing an accountant. So that's the problem. But if the accountant is now by law protected to disclose, and this is what happened after the global financial crisis, accountants can now disclose what they were forced to do, and they're protected by law. And that's very important. So continuing based on the example you shared, we need to also look at, okay, I think I mentioned this, there's a confusion of events happening together with it being the cause of another thing. Correlation equals causation. And then confusion of statistical significance with the probability of the null hypothesis being false. So a lot of my students think that if they reject the null at 0.05, that the probability that the null hypothesis is true is only 0.05. And then I have to always gently remind them, Iho, P is the probability of the data given the null. What you're saying is that it is the opposite. It is the probability of the null given the data. No, your reasoning is reverse. But even they did a survey of even experienced professors, and
Yeah,
they
it's
found,
easy to reverse the
yeah,
whole thing.
many of them were making that assumption. And then, of course, this is one of my pet peeve, not peeve, to confuse statistical significance with practical importance. I think it was a historical accident, really unfortunate that the term significance was used, because in daily language, we treat this to mean important, right? Statistically significant simply means improbable if the null were true. That's all it means. It has nothing to do with importance at all. I always tell my students, if somebody was selling me a hair regrow formula, and it says there that this has been shown to be statistically significant to increase your hair length, and then you only pay 1,000, then I ask my students, should I buy it? And then he will say, sir, of course you should. But if you read the fine print, the increase in your hair length is just 1 millimeter. But it is significant, meaning it's reliable. It will always increase your hair length by 1 millimeter. But that's all. Then they realize, oh, there's a very big difference between statistical significance and practical importance. So therefore, I tell them, that's why when somebody tells you his regression line is statistically significant, the question always is, show me the scatter plot. Because once you see the scatter plot, you can now have the instinct to tell yourself how much trust you're going to put on that regression line. You won't be dazzled by the number because you know what the scatter plot looks like. The same for the parent the son tries to impress the parent with his 92 average, but when show me all your grades, well, there's a 70 there, okay? So that's still a 70. Sure, you got 90s and 98s in all your other grades, but I want to know, what did we do to do this 70? So the thing always is that, yes, statistics can give you one piece of information, but you have to get as much information as you can to make proper interpretations. And of course, the mortal sin nowadays among many researchers is they fudge the data to get the result that they want. It's called P-hacking or harking. Harking stands for hypothesizing after the results are known. So if you want to be famous, you work backwards. You test the data first, and then find out what the statistical results are, and then work backwards and look for the literature to support that, and then present them in the opposite sequence. So it will appear as if you had a good hypothesis. Well, that's why nowadays in some research circles, you have to register your design first, and then everybody approves your design and they see it. That's the only time you gather your data. And then when you present your results, you put your data in a public repository so that everybody else can do a parallel analysis with you. So this is a trend now in research. So that's part of what we're trying to improve in the world of data. So I'd like to end here for the second part because I know that we set a 2-hour limit, right?
Yeah, and it's amazing how we basically shredded the 2 hours
Yes,
talking
yes,
about all
because
this. No,
there's a
yeah,
lot of, and this is where I would like to just summarize my point. Uh, Competence has to do with knowing how to use tools properly. And to use tools properly, we need to use them scientifically. And scientific use of tools means we know the difference between the tools and the world. And we never equate the tool with the world. Our duty is to the world. Just like in the model you were showing, our duty is to always check, does this tool really match the world? If it doesn't match the world, why are we using it? Then we have to explain to the public, well, because it has this ability to summarize, but it has this limitation. So please take that into account. So if we report a mean, we must always say, well, as you know, the limitation of the mean is that it is very sensitive to extreme values. So our GNP per capita is increasing each year, not because people are getting better off in the Philippines, but because we're producing more billionaires, and yet our poverty rate is exactly the same. But every time you have one more billionaire, it pulls the GNP per capita because you have to put in that 1 billion, even though the rest are earning 10,000. That's the same with the mean. So it gets pulled in that direction. For me, I think they should report the median more, but the median doesn't get its fair share. No? I think the median, and of course the mode. So I think we should report all. And instead of reporting statistics for central tendencies, I think you just report the whole distribution. and let people see that this is the shape of income in our country. You have this huge bump here with most people earning less than 100 pesos a day and literally starving, while you have 40 families that have 120 million condo units, and they're not even staying there. They just use it when they're feeling like they need a change of scenery. See, so but for our country to really progress, we have to realize that our ethical duty is to improve the world itself, and that's what professionals do. Doctors improve the state of our health. Lawyers improve the state of our freedoms and our rights. Engineers improve our safety and our ability to survive the elements. What do data professionals have to offer? They have models to offer, but these models must be guided by the ethical values that make it their duty to improve the quality of life of people. And if there's a real danger that their models will be used to use people, to abuse people, to cause mental health problems for people, to deprive people of loans that they deserve just because they are in the wrong demographic group, then they should put that in a statement, in a caveat. I'm not saying don't produce the model, but you must have a caveat there that says this model has the following limitations. It should not be used under these conditions. And that would be the mark of a true professional. So thank you for this opportunity, Doc. Wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's massive. I know mabibitin ng mga viewers natin, but I think there's always the next session.
Yep.
I think uh, I think this is about as good a point as any to end it on a high note, and I know there will be a lot of other conversations that will emerge as a result of this chat. So I thank you, Professor Ben, no, for sharing with us
My
your
pleasure.
perspective. And then, yeah, looking forward to the next chat. I mean, obviously, ethics is not something we solve with one podcast. There will be more podcasts to come.
Yeah.
So,
We squeezed 14 weeks of learning into 2 hours.
one semester into 2 hours, which is, yeah, amazing. Okay, so for everyone viewing, we've just had Professor Ben Teehankee of the at DLSU, and obviously the topic we talked about spans multiple podcasts. So please leave us your comments and your suggestions as you're viewing this. And again, thank you very much, Professor Teehankee. Until the next time, no, this is Data Ethics Conversations.
Okay, looking forward. Thank you.